Penishikiwa, Nimiyo Yanda Shinikashon Dylan Minor, Nimishum Tepwash Michif, Tepwasho Tabasiwa, Misako de Wanini, Dulisan Fantiawak, Natoshka, Michigan State University. Ani Buju Nichi Bimarisik, Bungieta Goninita, Nishnabemwin, Dylan Minor Dishnikash Yoganashimwin, Nin Indola, Misako de Wanini, Botagani Minis, Minwa Wasaksing. Minwa Slave Lake, Minwa Red River, Minwa Shibeshkong, Minwa Benedangajin, Onjaba, Mishomis, Anishinaabe Wakin, Donjaba, Nikwejangina, Chimiwech. My name is Dylan Miner. I'm a Wisakode or Michif or Métis artist based in Michigan on the other side of the medicine line. A couple of things before I actually start. I usually introduce myself in Michif as well as Nishnabemwin, so both languages spoken by Métis folks. My family comes, I was born on the other side of the medicine line in the Great Lakes in the peninsula that is Michigan. My family comes from, I'll talk a bit about it, but from the Georgian Bay harvesting community, which was kicked off of Drummond Island in the early 19th century, but also I have relatives coming from Slave Lake, Alberta, Red River, Manitoba, and across the Métis Nation homeland. My talk today is called Nimigan Denam, which means I feel like fighting. So today I feel like fighting. Thinking about that metaphorically in other ways, and like Natalie, I probably have far too many images to show and talk through today, so hopefully I will keep it limited and not bore you and put you all to sleep. As a little bit of a warning, I was a high school debater, as nerdy as that may be, but part of the rhetorical structure and style of high school debate was to talk as quickly as possible, to say as much stuff as you could in the limited time you had, given that I have not been able to decolonize my rhetorical and presentation style. So hopefully I will slow down a bit and not run through everything. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to say merci and miigwech to Stephen and Ashok, as well as to be here on Silex Nation territory. Also, of course, thanks Toby Lawrence for doing the logistical stuff to get me here. I know dealing with artists is probably not much fun, being an artist who doesn't respond to things. A third thing that I do, in addition to kind of acknowledging the territory we're on and kind of presenting who I am to start a talk, I think it's also important to recognize the ongoing settler colonial and patriarchal violence that exists in this nation state that is Canada, in the nation state that is the US, and throughout the settler colonial nation states of this hemisphere and globally. I think it's important to say the names and remember in this country, of course, there is an epidemic of violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit folks. Of course, we know that settler colonial jurisprudence doesn't always how would I say this, does not always find justice in the proper way. So I'd like to remember and name Tina Fontaine. You all know her and her story. Also name and remember Colton Bushy. And also name and remember Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, a Mon woman from Guatemala who was killed by ICE in the US, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So I think there is an ongoing violence against Indigenous peoples in this hemisphere, and by not naming and dealing with it, we continue to tacitly participate in that system. So my talk today will think about and utilize and engage with my practice. I'm also a scholar. I have a PhD in the history of art. Much of my work as of late has moved away from thinking and working in traditional scholarly ways, but very similar, I think, to Natalie's work, thinking about artistic practice in and of itself as an epistemological and ontological, as a disciplinary form of knowledge and reproduction and creation of knowledge. So I will walk through and migrate through in other contexts. I've talked about this as low riding. I'll kind of navigate us through a variety of different practices and projects that I'm working on, beginning with a discussion and conversation about my own Anikubijigan, that is my own ancestors and descendants. Much of my practice is founded in using and employing both Michif and Anishinaabe, that is Ojibwe or Odawa or Potawatomi words, as well as Métis words, as ones that are foundational to my practice and to my process. Much of my understanding comes from this term here, Anikubijigan, or in the plural, Anikubijigana, which relates and names both one's ancestors and one's descendants. It actually speaks specifically to 3 generations in either direction. But I find it very significant and important to think about, well, what does it mean when, in our worldview, we don't create distinctions between ancestors and descendants? When we speak of them, we're actually speaking in the same way. It breaks down linear notions of history and Western linearities and historiographies. So this is what's often called an octopus bag. Some call it a fire bag. This was made by my grandfather's grandmother. In conversations with, that's a picture of her on the left and then her mother on the right. In conversations with Métis art historian and scholar of Métis women's work, Sherry Farrell-Brissett, one of the things that she's noted and kind of has raised in her conversations is that usually we know the men who wear the bags. We oftentimes don't know the women bead workers themselves. And so one of the beautiful things about this particular octopus bag, which still resides in my family, is that we do know who made it and when. But of course, many of us, and I was in a conversation last night with Natalie talking about colonial entanglements within our own families. My mother's family are Scandinavian arrivals in Minnesota. They arrived in the 1870s. When we look at the creation of the nation state in the US, it's not inconsequential that 1862, which was the year of the Dakota 38, the largest mass hanging and execution in US history, is also the same year that we see the creation of the Homestead Act, which allowed settlers to move westward and get free land. And is also the same year as the creation of the Morrill Act, which revitalized or transformed higher education, created what are called in the US land grant universities. Basically, universities that are meant to democratize and give people free access, but there's a direct linkage between kind of settler colonial violence, the creation of universities, and also the opening of land in the West. So my family, my maternal family actually arrives in Minnesota, which is also in traditional Métis territory, about a decade or so after this particular mass hanging. And it's crucial to understand and to think about how all of these are linked together. Much like Natalie as well, I think our conversations and understandings are very much foregrounded in our territories and the locations we're at. So I direct an Indigenous Studies program at Michigan State University. I mentioned a minute ago, 1862 was the creation of the Morrill Act, which enabled and created land grant universities. The university I teach at calls itself the Pioneer Land Grant Institution, with no tongue-in-cheek when using the term pioneer. But I usually show this image of the state of Michigan, which goes through the main 8 treaties signed between Anishinaabe peoples and the nation state between 1807 and 1842. My university resides on 1819 Treaty of Saginaw Territory, so of course we're 1 year away from the 200th anniversary of that. If you look up here, right, of course that's Lake Superior, so we have Ontario here. It's crucial to think about this island there, which that's an island called Watagini-Minis. These are the 2 borderlands. Much of my work looks at the creation and maintenance of settler borders throughout North America, throughout Turtle Island. So on the left we see a map, an 1814 map, and on the right we see an 1848 map of the 2 borders, the US-Canada border and the US-Mexico border, and the way that those particular moments in time created and maintained and have an ongoing effect on Indigenous peoples, and my family included. So This map on the right, this is just a Google Maps image that I did a screenshot of a number of years ago. So this is basically the two Sault Ste. Maries, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario at the very top, Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan on the right. This is Lake Huron. If you know your Great Lakes geography, Indigenous history, that's Manitoulin Island. Manitoulin Island, of course, this big island here on the right, of course that's the world's largest freshwater island, but also has a number of reserves and was a place of ongoing annuity payments. So Niche folks would go there every year to get their payments and to engage in process. But Wakemekong First Nation, of course, we're here in unceded territory in British Columbia. Wakemekong First Nation is one of the other places that is unceded. So Wakemekong is on this island. I bring this image up because you can see here the way that the border kind of jumps around this particular island instead of cutting right through here. This island, often known as Drummond Island, we call it Wotagini-Minis, or the place where wild rice is milled, was where my community was, but because we had joined forces with the British and fought against the Americans in the War of 1812, when the border was drawn up, basically as a form of punitive damage, the border jumped around that island, and all the community members were forced to move eastward across Lake Huron in the Georgian Bay into a community called Penetanguishene or Benedanguishene, the place where the sands change shape because of the waves. So as an artist, I've actually created a project called the Wotagini-Minis or Drummond Island Land Reclamation Project, working with other relatives and other Métis folks, particularly descendants of what is called the Georgian Bay Harvesting Community, other folks in the community to actually acquire and create a space on that island. So to date, it's something that we're working on, but nothing is actually there on the island. Familial and personal history is significant to the work I do. So once our community moved east across Lake Huron into the Georgian Bay, we created a fur had a trap line there on the Shebeshekong River. In the language, Chi Bijagong would refer to a large panther. The word for underwater panther is Michipishu, Chi big, Bijig is a panther. So here, where the Shebeshekong River exits into the Georgian Bay or Lake Huron, what's interesting is in 1906, my grandfather's grandfather was arrested for poaching a deer on our traditional trap lines. And was ticketed and arrested for that. So I've actually engaged in a process of going back to that territory to try to harvest a deer as well. And you can see here on the two images on the right, the top one I actually created an installation where basically using old antique store mounted deer heads and put shrouds on them. And then created, you can see this image in the middle, which is an excerpt here down on the bottom right. I printed basically over 100. I did this in 2016, summer of 16, so 110 years from the date. Printed 110 of the arrest documents, which I found, like Natalie, in an archive, but printed them in animal blood. So these are screen prints, printed in blood, which were then gifted out. And the crazy thing too is that in the Google searching, right? So this is the territory right here, and that's where the fur trade would have been. But right here, where the river enters into the lake, is called Poacher's Point, which I think is kind of amazing. Hopefully that's named after our poacher. In that same way, kind of using some of these stories and relationships with the land, much of my work is involved in anti-extraction issues. In a bit, I'll show some agitprop graphics. I kind of have two strands, if you will, in my work, some which are very agitprop graphics created immediately, circulating online and used within Indigenous and anti-extraction and social justice movements. And then I have a gallery practice, which is a bit more nuanced in terms of engaging with similar ideas and similar thoughts on liberation and what that means, yet does so in a less didactic way. My great-grandfather was a union pipe fitter, and at the time of Standing Rock, and of course now we're dealing with TransCanada and so many other pipelines, expansion and maintenance of existing pipelines, I started thinking about the variety of pipes. And I was actually going to potentially give a different talk today, one that wasn't on my artistic practice, but is rather a book chapter I have coming out, which looks at the title, the English translation of it, because in Anishinaabe, the word for Americans is chimukaman, which has to do with big knives. And basically the paper that I was going to give actually said, and I can't think of the word right now that I got from an elder, but basically I asked him how you would say big pipelines, and said that in the future we won't talk about white folks as chimukamanan, but we'll talk about them as, they won't be big knives anymore, they'll be big pipelines. I think a lot about pipelines, and I think a lot about the various kinds of pipes, whether they're pipes used in ceremony, whether they're pipelines which move around fossil fuels, whether they're pipes that move water. In that context, I did this installation. Following that installation, I did looking at the arrest of my great-grandpa. So these are both in a gallery in Peterborough, Ontario, art space. One summer, I kind of did this installation with the deer heads and created a number of constellations using tips of deer antlers and animal blood and such. And the following year, I did this installation with all of these copper pipes. And these are all landscape images taken from roadside signage in the area, including this altar or offering of copper, pigment, and ochre. You can see here on the copper pipes, they become oxidized with my fingerprints, so literally my fingerprints and my DNA get marked into them. And then in the back gallery included this video installation with this ochre wall drawing. We're drawing directly onto the wall in ochre. So I start with this project in the conversation of how it relates to my own family story, because there are so many interstices, I don't know, relationships between land and the maintenance of sovereignty, and how do we participate in those things when settler institutions exist and maintain by enacting ongoing violences. As a theorist, much of my work responds to, as you've probably heard me say, settler colonial institutions. And as a tripartite system, settler colonialism works insofar as maintaining and exerting heteropatriarchal power, maintaining and exerting colonialism, whether it's the settler structure or a more traditional colonial version, as well as capitalist economic institutions. And while all of these tripartite systems are inflicting violences, communities are attempting and maintaining forms of sovereignty, relationships to land, relationships to kin, maintenance of language and knowledge, and what the great Anishinaabe writer would talk about would be Indigenous survivance. So as I'm working, I'm thinking about the ways that my work exists within these institutions and within these infrastructures, and responds to them in a way that I would say, using some of the ideas articulated, say, from Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian pedagogue, thinking about the notion of praxis, which of course is action, reflection, I've been thinking a lot about what an indigenous dialectic may or may not be. So of course the dialect is you have thesis, antithesis, and in those tensions between the two, something, usually synthesis emerges, but maybe there's actually something much more intimate and intricate going on. And when I think about my work, think about the way that this particular model, ceremony, reflection, action, ceremony, reflection, action, reflection, and how all of these relate together. Land is central to, I think, the work that I do and the work that most or many indigenous, contemporary indigenous artists do. And for me, this notion of aki gigendamwin. Aki is land, literally land, and gigendamwin is the notion of knowledge. So what does it mean to engage in knowledge production, kind of with, from, and in relationship to the land? So I spend a lot of time harvesting, and probably some of my most enjoyable times are harvesting. Unfortunately, because summer got busy, I wasn't able to harvest bark this summer, and missed my time up north in the bush with this elder, Howard Kimawan, who is a fluent speaker and language teacher from Okanagan First Nation. This is from the summer before this, harvesting bark. So in addition to my very traditional gallery practice and agitprop work, I also engage in kind of, I make a lot of baskets and do a lot of other things. Not insofar as being art objects, but rather being utilitarian, practice-based forms. So these are all baskets. The majority of these have been gifted away. All of these baskets were made quickly and then used in various things. I know there was a conversation at the artist panel last night about spruce root. So here is some harvesting of spruce root very recently. The image on the left is from harvesting some roots. I grew up and was raised in kind of like, my practice emerges out of my involvement in punk rock and making zines and kind of far left anarchist and other radical political sectors. So I'm interested in some ways, using some of those forms. So much of what I do now, I make, and I'll talk a little bit about my publishing practice, but really I'm making zines and calling them something different, calling them artist books, because it sounds fancier than making zines. I have a few with me. I have some artist books with me if you're interested, but I've also made these, since I'm a harvester of birch bark and also someone who does what's called birch bark bitings, I make these, I make basically 1-inch buttons out of birch bark. So all of those buttons are kind of the size of lapel buttons that you'd get at whatever band or whatever political event, yet are just thinned out birch bark. So some of the stuff I've made here. The top middle is called a birch bark biting, and the practice of one of the most well-known birch bark biters is actually a Cree woman from the plains who was doing it in the early and mid part of the 1900s, last century, named Angelique Morasti. According to the internet, that wonderful thing that is Google, there's only about a dozen people who practice, actively practice birch bark biting. Just in conversations with other biters, we put a list of 2 to 3 dozen people together, and these are just, these are mostly, just active folks who know one another. My guess is there's quite a few more. But basically, the process works by thinning out the bark and then folding it up like you would a snowflake, and then biting it with your canine teeth. The one in the bottom middle, that's actually a wild rice harvesting push pole. And it's been wrapped, and so that was made with Lee Sprague. He's the the Manuman or wild rice expert from Gun Lake Potawatomi community, but Michigan's most well-known wild rice expert. And the cool thing about that particular push pole, you can see it's wrapped in this weegob or basswood cordage that we made. And so it was interesting because usually, at least all the ones that have been made in the last 100 years or so, are all wrapped with nylon rope. So kind of going back to making of cordage and doing that. This is our urban sugar bush. So in the city, and these are some sugar cones that I made this year. So I'm going to transition a bit into some of the more studio practice. It's linked together, I think. This is an ongoing project. Most of my projects are ongoing, which means I start something. The beautiful thing about being an artist is you don't know shit, you just do it and say that it's a project. That's kind of the way that I see my place in the world at this point, is that there's knowledge that for some reason doesn't get to me. You know, my great granny was an herbalist, and that knowledge doesn't get to me. So I started a project called Michif Michin, the People of Medicine, and started collaborating with plants, started meeting with knowledge keepers, and started spending time in the bush. And as an artist, right, there's that space, there's that mobility to do so. This is an ongoing installation project. I think this image is from Martha Street Studio in Winnipeg. It's also been at Banff, and it's also been at Articule in Montreal. The English language is he, she, or they drums secretly. It's a series of up to a few hundred marching band bass drum covers, which can be installed on the wall or on the floor, which make no noise. So I'm interested in here, in this, kind of the maintenance of practices when those practices may or may not be there. I have another project, which I'm not talking about here, called Gikinawabi, which is the art of learning, or it's a verb that talks about to learn through observation. So what happens to practices when there's no one to learn from in your community? And through the weaving conversation last night, the beautiful thing is that, you know, and even I think in Natalie's work is what do we do? You know, there's archives, you know, there's colonial documents. We can turn to those. I know a lot of language communities who are reclaiming language will turn to those. But it's a complicated conversation. And this one here is about silence. It's about practices. There's these 3 moose halls installed into the wall, and in each of them have an audio clip of the land speaking. So they're just audio from the land playing on a loop. Visiting, I've written and talked a lot about visiting in my practice, and utilizing my space within institutions to think through and to visit. So in conversations with elders, retired auto workers, they said nobody visits anymore. Through urbanization, through whatever, through the internet, through TV, through just the fact that we're all busy people, you know, the lament was we don't visit anymore. So I started thinking, you know, like many other artists, right? I struggle with social anxiety, and I'm kind of a weirdo and don't like to visit people. So I was like, oh, well, I'll call it a project, and then it'll force me to visit people. So I started doing that, transforming various community spaces, art galleries, university spaces, holding tea times, with no other intention than maintaining and creating new social relationships between and amongst people. And so this is one of the iterations up in Dawson City, Yukon. I'll go back to that. So part of this visiting is also creating tea spaces. This is in Gallery Gachet in Vancouver, University of Michigan. And all of these prints that are going along with these visiting spaces, these are all relief prints of medicinal plants that are printed in inks that I make from berries I harvest. So there's that relationship happening here. I'm going to go back for a few. I should put these out of order. And the visiting for me includes elements such as this, just taking time in institutional spaces, but also engaging in ongoing youth workshops. So a significant component of my work is is working with youth, whether it's doing youth screen printing workshops. This was, you can see there on the screen print, this is with the youth at Saginaw Chippewa, in the Saginaw Chippewa community at the Zebwing Center, which is their tribal museum. And this is just a few weeks ago with a group of Anishinaabe students in Western Michigan and an elder from the Grand River Bands of Ottawa. So visiting, harvesting, relationships with place, with land are all central. These are bikes that I built in Vancouver, linked to the exhibition that Tanya Willard curated called Beat Nation. Working with students at Fort Lewis College in Colorado, which is a former boarding school. Some younger Diné artists, all of these bikes. You can see on the first one, basically they have seed savers on them, so they're both lowrider bicycles as well as useful archives themselves. So so they're the three sisters, corn, bean, and squash, and each of them have collections of indigenous varieties of seeds, which were then planted. The fourth bike there is a bike in homage to Popé, who of course led the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, one of the first and probably most successful anti-colonial indigenous insurrection in what is now the U.S. Pushed the Spanish forces back to what is now El Paso, Texas. This is at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. A show called To Build Up Invincible, which actually comes from archival research. The gallery, the museum itself sits a block away from a former Industrial Workers of the World Union Hall. There was another Industrial Workers of the World Union Hall, which was a far left labor union here in Canada. It was affiliated with the OBU, the One Big Union, which of course were kind of tied into, if not directly central to, the Winnipeg General Strike, which we're coming up on the 100th anniversary next summer. But the gallery, the museum sits on a space that is right next to a former union hall, and there's another one just down the road, Woodward Avenue, which was the old Ojibwe walking path, Michigan State Highway 1. There's one just down the road, which was recently demolished. The union hall wasn't demolished, but the building that the union hall was in was demolished to build a stadium for the basketball and hockey team, which had the wonderful name of being called the Little Caesars Arena. Of course, Little Caesars Pizza is an awful pizza company, but you can get your $5 hot and ready. So what I did was actually transform the museum into a union hall and a cultural center that had a library, it had a theater space, as well as these, it had that mobile print bike there, which could be taken out and used for screen printing, as well as these series of banners and pennants taken both from lost radio broadcasts. So these poetic texts there with these animal drawings, those are all taken from 1930s radio broadcasts that the Union did, and the pennants all are inscribed with fragments of letters written by a mentor of mine, Carlos Cortez Coyhuica, a Chicano labor activist from Chicago. And this here is the library that we created there, and one of the prints that was made as part of the exhibition. When did I start? Did I start like at 1? Oh, wait,
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay, good. Because the clock up here says it's 12:45, and I'm like,
All right.
yeah. That clock runs on Indian time. This one runs on settler time, apparently. So this section, I'm going to walk through some graphics, and then I'm going to end with the 3 projects I'm working on while I'm in residence here for exhibitions in the fall. Nimiga Vendam means I feel. The N at the beginning has to refer to I. If you wanted to say he or she feels like fighting, or they feels like fighting, you would say Miga Vendam. So I feel like fighting has to do with the agitprop political graphics that I make. This was one, of course, most of these are created very immediately. These sorts of works basically are created within anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, and then presented and freely accessible for various movements. And same things with the images for Colton or Tina or Claudia, right? When these very frequent, unfortunately frequent violences happen, I respond in ways by making images, such as this, which circulated and was used at Standing Rock, or this image here, which is in response to Enbridge Line 5. Enbridge Line 5 is a pipeline that enters the US at what is Superior, Wisconsin. So it's bringing tar sands oil basically from the prairies to be processed in Sarnia, Chemical Valley. And of course, Chemical Valley does lots of violence to Indigenous nations right there. And the work of the Gray sisters, Vanessa Gray, are doing important work on ecological violence against Anishinaabe communities in and around Chemical Valley and what's now Sarnia. But Enbridge Line 5 basically takes oil from tar sands to be processed, cuts across Michigan's Upper Peninsula through the Straits of Mackinac, which is basically the place where Lake Huron and Lake Michigan meet together. It's both an ecologically sensitive area, but it's also a sacred space in the migration story. The word Mackinac comes from the Anishinaabe one, Mikanak. Gichi Mikanak is the large turtle. So it's both a sacred space and environmentally sensitive space. So this work was made in protest to that, of course, and this is myself and my partner and the elder I work with, Howard, and two others in a Wigawash Jiman, or a birch bark canoe, basically at a protest at the Straits of Mackinac. That's the Mackinac Bridge, and that pipeline runs underneath that area. So there was a pipe out, paddle out series of ongoing protests every fall. This was a couple of years ago. Mishkiki wabu awan nibish, water is medicine. Nestle sucks. No other way to put it. Quite violent. I grew up at a time when, as a child, and many of you remember this, right? There were boycotts of Nestle because of what they were doing in the so-called third world. I would use third world to talk about non-socialist, non-capitalist entities, but many people use it to talk about developing economies. Of course, Nestle in the 1970s went there and was giving away free formula. But women didn't have access to clean water to make the formula, then became dependent on it, right? So Nestle has a very violent history. A few years ago, the CEO of Nestle, in an interview, said that water is not a right. In the state of Michigan, there's a particular, they pull groundwater up and bottle it as Ice Mountain. And they just basically, the state of Michigan, the DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, which are the same folks that fuck things up for water in Flint. My parents live in Flint, and if you've been attentive to that situation with lead in the water, that was, the government, the state government went in and delegitimized a democratically elected city government, forced them to change their water access, and in the end, thousands of young people and thousands of community members were basically given lead poisoning by this top-down decision-making. So the DEQ is not respected, but the DEQ allowed Nestle to up their intake of water, taking over 720 million gallons annually from the ground, and only paying the same rate that anyone in this room would pay for using that water. So they're paying basically the right, they're paying for the water as if they were an average citizen. And you can see here on the statistics, over 81,000 people responded. Most of them were against this decision to allow them access. But of course, we know what probably happens. Well, we know what does happen. Okay. A couple of other images. Much of my work is about hemispheric indigeneities and thinking about the way that settler colonial immigration policies do violence to Indigenous and Latinx peoples moving northward, oftentimes moving north in response to U.S. foreign policy, whether it was violence that was created by the undermining of Central American governments in the 1980s, or the destabilizing of subsistence agriculture by the the funding of foodways in the U.S. Lots of things are happening, but drawing some of those linkages. Again, far too much. And let me just show you these are some of the books I'm working on lately. Some of them are poetry books, all small print press. If people are familiar with risography or risographs, doing a lot of small run, 100, 200 edition texts using risograph. Small run sets of posters and broadsides. Poetic texts. Small publication I did, another publication, and I have some copies of these if people are interested. These are risograph publications. And finally, just to end on the 3 projects I'm working on here. One of them is a series of cyanotypes, and a solo exhibition based on cyanotypes. The year the cyanotype was invented, 1842, I think is the year is the same, or rather developed, is the same year the last treaty is signed in the state of Michigan, ceding land. So thinking about those interrelationships. These are cyanotypes that are then painted, dyed, smoked, covered in petroleum, rubbed with earth and copper. There's 170, whatever the number of years it's been, 176 of the small ones, which are about a foot square, as well as a number of, I'll be printing one that's 2 meters by 5 meters. A series of banners and pennants. These are 8 foot by 2 foot on the right, and the other ones are 5 foot. The text on the left has to do with the response that a chief gave in 1821 to the treaty processes. So I've selected out and edited, like I did for the exhibition in Detroit, fragments from those, poetic fragments from those, and then mixed them with these drawings. So on the left it's cedar, on the right it's wild rice. And then the third project is for an exhibition in Mississauga, Ontario. Tanya Willard has work there as well, curated by Christine Shaw, where it's this weird, fucked up site of post-industry and commerce and ongoing extractive industry, processing, and these weird, a park, all of these weird things. But I'm making these series of portals or platforms on the site, which are made from old growth wood and then edged in copper. So they sit kind of right at the ground level. One will be at the water. It's on the shore of Lake Ontario. So one will be, it'll be like a dock but at water level, and then a series of 7 total doorways or portals, thinking about relationship between earth and sky, water and sky, earth and water and sky as well. So I'll end there. I've probably gone on a bit too much. So Chi Miigwech, thank you so much, and look forward to the panel.